The realization did not arrive as shock or outrage, but as a slow, uncomfortable clarity that settled in my chest and refused to move, the kind of understanding that does not demand immediate action but quietly rearranges everything that comes after it. I began noticing patterns not because I was searching for them, but because they had grown consistent enough to reveal themselves without effort, small repetitions in Elena's behavior that suggested intention rather than instinct. What unsettled me was not the discovery of malice, because there was none to be found, but the recognition of something far more difficult to confront: purpose without affection. I first understood this during a conversation that should have been unremarkable, a discussion about an upcoming visit from an old friend of my wife's, someone we had not seen in years but who had reached out with warmth and familiarity. Elena listened as we spoke, nodding thoughtfully, and then offered a series of observations about timing, logistics, and my wife's current state that concluded with a suggestion to postpone indefinitely. Her reasoning was sound, her tone calm, and her concern for my wife's comfort explicit, yet there was something final in the way she spoke, as though the matter had already been decided and we were simply being informed of the conclusion. I agreed in the moment, because disagreement felt unnecessary and faintly irresponsible, but the exchange lingered with me in a way similar moments had not. I realized that Elena had not asked what my wife wanted, nor had she left space for that question to matter. She had assessed, evaluated, and resolved the situation according to criteria that did not include our preferences as independent variables. The absence of consultation was subtle, but it carried a weight that unsettled me, not because it was disrespectful, but because it was efficient. From that point forward, I began observing Elena with a different lens, not one of suspicion, but of attention. I noticed how she framed choices as risk management rather than desire, how she spoke about relationships in terms of value and cost rather than connection, and how she referenced our well-being as a justification rather than a shared goal. These were not alarming traits in isolation. In many contexts, they would be praised as maturity and foresight. What troubled me was how consistently they positioned her at the center of decision-making without acknowledging the shift. The true depth of her perspective revealed itself gradually, through comments that might have seemed innocuous to anyone else. She spoke of our assets with familiarity that bordered on ownership, of our home as a responsibility she would eventually shoulder, and of our reputation as something fragile that required careful handling. She described herself as our advocate in conversations where we were not present, explaining that people misunderstood us, that they questioned our judgment, that they worried about our capacity to manage things independently. She delivered these reports with concern rather than triumph, as though burdened by the necessity of managing perceptions we could no longer be trusted to shape ourselves. It was in these moments that I recognized the framework Elena had constructed, one in which my wife and I existed as variables to be stabilized rather than individuals to be consulted. She did not speak of us with contempt, nor did she express frustration or resentment. Instead, she spoke with a detached sense of responsibility, the way one might discuss a complex system that required oversight. Her language was careful, measured, and devoid of emotional excess, which made it difficult to challenge without sounding defensive or ungrateful. The darkest realization was not that Elena was manipulating us, because manipulation implies deceit, and she rarely lied. The truth was more unsettling. She believed, with quiet certainty, that she knew what was best for us, and that belief rendered our preferences secondary. She had internalized a narrative in which love was synonymous with control, where devotion justified authority, and where outcomes mattered more than consent. This was not cruelty born of anger, but entitlement shaped by years of trust and reinforced by our own willingness to step back. I shared these observations with my wife cautiously, aware of how fragile her confidence had become and how easily concern could be reframed as anxiety. She listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed, and then said something that confirmed what I had been struggling to articulate. She told me that she no longer felt like the primary subject of her own life, that decisions seemed to occur around her rather than with her, and that while she appreciated Elena's care, she felt increasingly uncertain about her own voice. The relief in her admission was immediate, as though naming the discomfort allowed it to exist without shame. Together, we began to see the structure Elena had built, not as a conspiracy, but as a system that functioned because we had allowed it to. We had rewarded her efficiency, deferred to her judgment, and accepted her interpretations without question, creating an environment in which her authority felt natural rather than imposed. The realization carried with it a profound sense of responsibility, because it meant that whatever harm was unfolding had been facilitated by our own trust and desire for ease. What complicated matters further was the absence of a clear transgression, no singular act that could be confronted or corrected without unraveling the entire dynamic. Alena had not stolen from us, insulted us, or overtly restricted our freedom. She had simply redefined the parameters of our agency while framing the shift as protection. To challenge her directly would require accusing her of intentions she would not recognize as harmful, and in doing so, we risked confirming the very narrative of instability she had been quietly circulating. It was then that we understood confrontation would not restore what had been lost, because the issue was not behavior but belief. Alena did not see herself as overstepping, she saw herself as fulfilling a role that had been implicitly assigned to her. Any attempt to reclaim authority through force or accusation would only reinforce her conviction that we were no longer capable of making sound decisions. The irony was painful, because the more we resisted, the more we would appear to validate her perspective. The question, then, was not how to expose her, but how to allow the truth of her worldview to reveal itself without our intervention. We did not need to unmask her, because she was not hiding. We needed to remove ourselves from the position of insulation that made her authority appear benevolent. This realization marked the moment when fear gave way to resolve, not in the form of anger or vengeance, but in a quiet commitment to reclaiming our presence without provoking the narrative she had constructed. By the end of that period, the sense of betrayal I might have expected never fully materialized, replaced instead by a colder understanding of how love can be repurposed when boundaries are left undefined. Alena had not turned against us in any dramatic sense, she had simply stepped into a role that blurred the line between care and control, believing that the ends justified the means. The knowledge did not bring immediate clarity or comfort, but it did provide something essential, a direction forward that did not require confrontation, only patience and a willingness to let reality speak for itself.